We're talking about the evolution of leadership and how leadership has really distinguished itself from management in recent times. It used to be that the best managers were considered the leaders, but that is not necessarily the case anymore. And one of the things that we're going to talk about is how 21st century leadership has really distinguished itself from management. There's a very famous saying that management is doing things right, but leadership is doing the right thing. And so, managers are good at doing things on time and on budget, but leaders are more inclined to have a vision of doing the right things. For example, Martin Luther King, "I have a dream" speech. That is the kind of thing that is inspirational for a major change. That is not limited by, time and place. And so certainly leadership emerges as a much bigger a concept and a more difficult one, okay? It is much harder to be a leader in the 21st century than it has been at any time in the past. And there are some really good reasons for that, and that's what I want to talk about now. America was really kind of the big dog in the world coming out of World War II. We had defeated the Nazis, we had defeated the Japanese, we had saved Europe, and basically we were having our way with the military, with the economy, and everything was going very well. And when all the soldiers came back from World War II, with things like the GI Bill, there were opportunities for a lot of working stiffs to become middle class. And so what happened is a lot of people in the 1950s, they got education, they got money, they got houses, they got cars. And so the average worker in the 1950s, as they became middle class, they didn't necessarily have to or want to listen to anybody about stuff. As a group, they had political power in their ability to vote and spend their dollars. And so that made leadership much more difficult because we didn't just listen to people because they were the boss. I think the previous generation, they listened to authority. You're a policeman, I'm going to listen to you. I'm not going to question whether you are right or wrong, whether I want to do that or not. You're a policeman. You're a fireman. You're a priest. You're a teacher. You're my dad. You're my uncle. You're my sergeant, okay? And so a lot of people in the 1950s said, hey, I don't want to do that. I want to do what the heck I want to do. I got the money. I got the house. I got the car. I'm going to do what I want. And so with this burgeoning middle class, right, people who were more educated and more financially secure, they didn't necessarily have to listen or want to listen to people. And they also didn't need the job. Prior to World War II, people were happy to have a job. There were things like the Great Depression, so they were just happy to have a job, any job, just to put food on the table. And one job was pretty much the same as the next. After World War II, there were choices. You can work in different industries, different fields. And for the first time, you had a lot of people doing white-collar work. So if you went to college on the GI Bill and you had a desk job, that was much more respected than a factory worker. And so you felt like you could pretty much be your own person, okay? So leadership became more challenged in the 1950s, okay? How are we going to get people to follow directions or follow the objectives or follow the strategies? That became more difficult. So there were fewer people who could influence and inspire. A lot of it had to do with a person's own self-awareness. If a leader was confident, if they were somewhat sensitive, if they were somewhat self-aware, then they could provide more leadership. You get more flies with honey than with vinegar approach, right? Prior to World War II, the bosses were all vinegar. And then some of the smart leaders after World War II said, hey, I'm going to sweeten things up to get things that I want. Okay, so this self-awareness was very important. And one of the things that came out of the 1950s and 60s was the continued development of psychology, something called the Big Five personality traits. This is where we started looking at people as more than just warm bodies, right? Hey, I got a factory job. I'm putting axles on a Ford Model T assembly line. I just need a guy with muscles. Now all of a sudden was, hey, I need some guy who's good with math, or I need some guy who's good writing, or I need some guy who's good with analysis. So the psychologists developed the Big Five personality traits, and that basically enabled leaders to treat people as differently as more individuals. So there were things like, is this person an introvert or an extrovert? Is this person open or closed? Is this person agreeable or non-agreeable? Is this person emotionally stable or not? Is this person conscientious? And see, why that mattered is because if you were a leader and you can tell that one of your workers was conscientious, you didn't have to hover over that person. You could say, hey, Jim, I need you to do this, and a conscientious person would do it. And that saved a lot of time and got much better performance. If a person was an introvert, if a person was shy, you wouldn't waste your time trying to make that person a salesperson, because introverts traditionally are not the best salespeople. Extroverts are. But that knowledge helped the leadership and the followership work better. Same thing for openness. If you had a job that required creativity, that required new product innovation, then maybe even product invention, well, then you would want a very open person who would look at the world not in terms of what is what could be. And so this psychological awareness enabled leaders to have a much better handle on how to treat people individually. Of course, out of this, now that people were more independent, what are the leaders doing? Well, the leaders, now that they don't have to hover and watch, they are spending more time focusing on having a vision for making things better. They are focusing more on their emotional intelligence. I've got to be better with people in order to be a good leader. And so a lot of leaders started focusing on things like morality, ethics, courage, trust, those kind of squishy things, those kind of things we call soft skills. To be perfectly honest with you, the things that had been previously attributed to femininity, okay? The thing that I know really bothers some people is that management is more of a masculine endeavor. Hit my deadline, meet my bottom line, get things done. Men are more kind of focused on that tangible kind of precision. Women are more geared toward sensitivity, tolerance, patience, acceptance. Oh, you bruised your knees, Johnny, here, let mommy kiss it and make it better. That's what mothers are used to doing with children. Well, that was kind of what you found to be needed among your subordinates. This person is frustrated because they can't solve this problem. You didn't really solve it by saying, grow up, stop being a baby, get your job done. That was a militaristic model that used to work but didn't anymore. It was kind of like, hey, Jimmy, how can I help you with that problem? Let's brainstorm it. Let's work it together. Let me get you a new magazine subscription that deals with those problems. And so the feminine attributes of nurturing and supporting and encouraging and empathy, that became more prevalent after World War II in terms of leadership qualities. And again, I know as a guy it's not cool to say that the better jobs require us to get in touch with our feminine self, but that seems to be the truth. So Then what happened was we got into the 1960s, okay? And so, again, this is part of a gradual evolution. This is not something where you flip a switch and you go from management to leadership. This is something that happens very slowly over time. But in the 1960s, what we had is a cultural revolution, okay? We really had things like the civil rights movement. We had the Vietnam War. We had the hippie movement, the summer of love, peace, love, and understanding, you know, drug, sex, and rock and roll. A lot of people were questioning some of the traditional American values, okay? African Americans were given equal opportunity at work, okay? Again, people started questioning authority. Birth control came out, so people felt that they could have sex outside of marriage. Fashion changed, right? Even something as simple as pantyhose were invented so girls could wear shorter skirts, okay? All these things were kind of happening, and so the 60s were very tumultuous. So what does that mean, okay? Well, if you're a leader, okay, you're dealing with a lot of questioning, a lot of rebellion. You've got people who are smoking marijuana in college, have a degree in computer science, and now they're working for an old fart that doesn't seem to be with it, man. You know, doesn't really get where the younger generation is coming from. And so that became a very difficult task for leaders, because if leaders were raised old school, they didn't necessarily know how to deal with the generation gap. And I know there's always been a generation gap. Every generation is not fully understood by the previous generation. But this was more of a quantum leap. This was not a minor change of the younger generation. This was like a wholesale questioning. You know, why should America be in Vietnam? I know we won World War II, but we've got nothing against these people in Vietnam. We're not dealing with Hitler here, okay? And so, again, you know, you had some academic, Timothy Leary, who invented LSD, and so now people were going on acid trips. And rock and roll became a real vehicle for expressing our rebellion and our dissent. And so you'd have Woodstock. So all of this awareness, all this raising of consciousness, you know, from a cultural point of view, it is what it is. But from a leadership point of view, how do I deal with this, right? I'm a guy who fought in World War II, and now I'm responsible for managing this hippie, this long hair. We never allowed for facial hair. What's this guy got a beard for? You know, why's this guy got a ponytail? Why can I see this girl's thigh in her work dress? You know, this is kind of almost comical to look back on it, but it was freaking people out. And so leaders had a very, very difficult time figuring out how to inspire, how to motivate this new generation. Not only that, but there were people who had never worked with African Americans before. They had never worked with Hispanics before, whether they were from a segregated area or not. You know, the Title VII Equal Opportunity Act in 1964 meant that you had to hire someone based on their qualifications, not on their race, religion, ethnicity, etc. And so I can remember working at a company, and some of the older guys would not work for a woman. If there was a woman promoted, they had difficulty because they thought women are supposed to be barefoot and pregnant at home. There were people who didn't know how to behave in front of African Americans. And luckily, I was a product of the 60s and 70s, so it was more normal to me. But a lot of the older guys just retired at 55 rather than change with the times, okay? And speaking of women, in the 1970s, we had women's liberation, right? Again, I'm not here to comment on whether that was a good thing or a bad thing for the world, for the culture. The point is, it was a different thing. And the point is, women were in the workforce, okay? Prior to this time, most women were secretaries, nurses, teachers, And a lot of women were just waiting to get married and have a family. It was still very popular to have the traditional family structure back then. And so you had a single breadwinner. The man was the income earner, and the mom was, the domestic engineer, the domestic goddess, right? And so now that you had women saying, why should I work 40 hours a week for $20,000 a year? Why don't I work 40 hours a week for $40,000 a year? Well, that became a different phenomenon. A lot of guys did not know how to supervise women. You know, women were objects. Women were sex objects to be attracted to. Women were people to date and lust after. They were not people to do the accounting and bookkeeping in your office. And even worse, when the women, the kind of cutting edge women liberals became vice presidents at corporations, a lot of guys were not able to take orders from women. Again, I'm not here to judge whether that's right or wrong. A lot of these people were good and decent people who were just raised with a different set of values, and this became very difficult for them. But when you think about it, we doubled the workforce by having women come in the workforce, and what happened is a lot of men lost their jobs, because if you had a man who was making 60 grand a year, and now you have a woman who's willing to work for 40, because she was usually making 20, well, then the companies are benefiting, the woman is benefiting, and the only guy who's hurting is the guy who wants to have a traditional one earner family, okay? And so he can't make it anymore. So you can imagine how that changed leadership, okay? People had to be much, much better at leaders to deal with a diverse workforce, people of color and women. That made things different, okay? And then, to further complicate things, spoiler alert, this is not getting easier, and it will not get easier. It's just going to get more difficult. In the 1980s, what you had was a really globalization emphasis. Up until then, America, like I said, was kind of the big dog. We came and went the way we wanted. We had our way. We were the elephant in the room, however you want to describe it. But in the 1980s, you started to get globalization. You started to get foreign companies able to invest in America. You know, the car companies in the 70s, the Hondas, the Toyotas, the Nissans, the companies that started doing well, they started building plants in America. So you might be able to get a job in a factory, but it may be working for a company that was Japanese owned. So you were working for an organizational culture that was not American. It was Asian. And so it was a great company. You liked your boss, but they had a different philosophical orientation to management and leadership. And so that became a further adjustment. To get promoted in a foreign company took a different type of leadership style, and to be successful working for foreign leaders took a different style. And it wasn't just Japan, it became Korea, it became the Netherlands, it became England, it became Germany, just a lot of globalization. Likewise, American companies had to do more business overseas. So for example, I worked at a company and I had a great job at a great company, but our business was in Latin and Central America. Well, I had people who were working for me who were Venezuelan, who were Chilean, Argentinian, Brazilian, Mexican, etc. And so I could not just be my typical American self, could not be the ugly American and expect to get the same good kind of results in these other countries. Yet these other countries were producing a tremendous amount of revenue, a tremendous amount of profit. So there was a great opportunity to be successful abroad. But some of these countries were second world countries or third world countries. They weren't places where things were done like they were done in America. So again, as a leader, you have to be able to deal with the Latin culture, right? It's kind of like a great hitter who can't hit the curveball. He's a great hitter with the fastball, but he can't hit the curveball. So it doesn't take very long for the opposing manager to give this guy a diet of all curveballs, right? So if you couldn't hit the curveball, pretty soon you were off the team because you had a weakness. Well, that happened with Latin America. If you were one of those jingoist Americans who felt that these Hispanic countries were beneath you or inferior to you, well, you didn't have the right attitude to get the productivity out of them. And so again, it was another layer, it was another dimension of management that separated itself from leadership, okay? In the 1990s, we had the technology boom. We had the internet. We had the digital world. We had email, okay? And so what you had here is you had a lot of people who were replaced by machines. Prior to this, you had automation in factories where robots or machines like forklifts, they replaced human muscle, right? A forearm and a back can't lift as much as a hydraulic machine. So people had lost their jobs in factories. But with the technology and computers, people were losing their jobs who had relied on brain power, okay? I can remember in the 70s, everyone had a secretary. You did not have to type your own letters. You did not have to make your own travel reservations. Your secretary did it. But now that you had a desktop computer, you lost your secretary, okay? You lost your travel agent. And so technology really changed leadership in the 1990s because computerization replaced a lot of the things that were done by people. Now, again, I'm not making a value judgment. There was a lot of, grunt work that was done by people, and not having to do the grunt work and the work that people hated, that freed people up to be more creative, to do more worthwhile kind of projects. Yes, that's good, but again, a lot of people lost their jobs, and a lot of middle managers lost their jobs. A lot of people who were of average college success, they ended up being middle managers. And the same way factory workers in the 50s were able to be middle class and provide for the American dream with upward mobility, a lot of middle managers in the 90s, they lost their jobs because they were being replaced by computerization. And so the leaders who set the direction and the vision for the companies ended up with much leaner and meaner staffs, and that required a different type of management, okay? So all those things, the 50s, the 60s, and the 70s, 80s, and 90s, those really, really changed the nature of leadership. And basically what happened, bottom line is, the best managers who became the leaders were no longer qualified to be leaders. You see, because managers are good at planning, organizing, budgeting, deciding. That's what managers do. And as I mentioned, the good ones do things correctly. Their work is done on time and on budget. But that was not necessary for leaders in the 21st century. Leaders had to stop motivating and start inspiring, because if no one follows you, you are not a leader, right? By definition, followers make a leader. And so followership became a very big characteristics of leaders. Who wants to follow whom? Okay, I'm going to follow the person that I believe in. Okay, I'm going to follow the person who inspires me. I'm going to follow the person who empowers me, who meets my needs. Okay, and so what you found is a lot of positive reinforcement being done by leaders. You found a lot of um, nurturing, a lot of modeling of a certain type of behavior, a certain ability to help people meet their own needs. Because, see, people were very different. Okay, you had, if you had a dual income couple with working moms, well, you now had to help your best employees balance their work and professional lives, right? Well, what did that mean? Well, that means there are going to be some days when a parent wants to be at the soccer game or the recital. That means when someone's going to get a frantic call from the school that their child is sick. And so what you found is much more enabling as a servant than you did kind of ordering around as a boss. So what were some of the skills that were more necessary for leaders in the 21st century? Well, again, that emotional intelligence, more of a spiritual focus, okay? We are focusing on your heart and soul more than your body and mind. What is enabling me to feel good? What is enabling me to have faith in what I'm doing? Okay? So in some ways, leaders have become part minister and part psychologist, because their job is to make people feel good so their people can do the job. Prior to the 21st century, most of things were about competition. We've got to beat this other company. We've got to beat this other guy. And now it was more about collaboration and cooperation. We've got to work together as a team. No one person can do it by themselves. So how can I get the team to work together? We've seen this in sports, where the underdog team puts in a certain amount of effort and beats a much more talented team in the big game. Okay? We talk about that inspirational locker room talk that the coach gave, to get their people to believe and have the faith and the trust and the confidence to beat the big bad team. That's exactly what was required in the workplace. Communication, again, being able to write well, being able to speak well, being able to relate. Okay, you don't just relate to people who are like you. You've got to relate to people who are different than you, different ages, different religions, different genders. And it's not just different, Protestant religions. Diversity in the 1950s meant Presbyterian, Lutheran, Episcopalian, Baptist. Now you got one Hindu, you got one Buddhist, you got one Arab, you got one Muslim, you got one Catholic. So, it takes a lot more ability to relate to all those different types of people. It isn't just relating to Hispanics. You have a Mexican Hispanic, a Puerto Rican Hispanic, a Cuban Hispanic, a Spain Hispanic, okay? There's a lot of diversity. You could say the same thing about the Asians. The Koreans are not the same as the Japanese. The Japanese are not the same as the Taiwanese. The Taiwanese are not the same as the Vietnamese or the Chinese. And so as we got into that complicated world, it became much more difficult to work with a diverse team and get the same kind of results that was wanted, okay? Your main job was to create a vision. A leader creates a vision for the future which doesn't exist. And of course, that's much harder to see the future in your mind's eye than it is something tangible. So as you were creating a vision, and again, this could be for your family, for your church, for your club, for your team. You don't have to be president of the United States to have a vision. You can have a vision for your kids going to college, and you have to, figure out how that happens. The missions were more left to the managers. Okay, they were the ones who interpreted the vision into some sort of mission. Okay, power became a really different subject. Power is oftentimes associated with someone brutally bullying other people, right? I have the power for you to live or die. I have the power to hire or fire. I would have to say that one of the big changes in the 21st century is that power was used very gently and very discriminately. You really don't get anywhere by trying to force people to do something. You know, if a big person beats up a little person, I don't think any of us really admire that, right? You would expect that to happen. But if a big person, you know, bends over to help a littler person, you know, reach something in the supermarket, that is something that we maybe kind of admire a little bit more. Again, it's a little bit kinder and gentler use of power as opposed to force. Ethics and morality became very important. It's not only what you did, but how you did it. You know, the media and you know, there's cameras and there's microphones everywhere. So people are always watching how you conduct yourself. And so how you did things were important. And if you were to cheat or if you were to steal, you were to get caught, and your career would be kind of ruined. As I said, there was a need, much more of a need for a team culture, and leadership was much more creating feelings and attitudes in people. I can remember a story that kind of shown the difference between the kind of inspiration you could create. There's this guy walking, you know, in France during the 1600s, there's this guy walking into a town, and he sees one guy on one corner chiseling away at some marble, and he sees another guy chiseling away at marble. So he goes to the first guy, and he says, "Hey, man, what are you doing?" "Oh, man, this sucks. I'm just chiseling on this stone all day. I got this wooden hammer that's not very strong. I got this dull chisel. It's taken me all day to square up this piece of marble." And then he goes to the other guy who's doing the exact same thing, and he says, "Well, what are you doing?" And he says, "Oh, man, I'm building God's house." And so the same actual thing can mean totally different things to different people, and that's really kind of a summary of what leadership has become in the 21st century. Can you make your people feel like they are doing the equivalent of God's work? Things that are meaningful and valuable, and people choose to do it freely. Well, thanks very much for watching. We hope you enjoyed the video. If you like what you heard, please give us a like. If you'd like to see more of these sessions, please subscribe.